Hey guys, this video is for my sophomores. I'll be posting some reading assignments that I want you to do over the next week. I'll be posting that on my website, bg.charlesevans.net. All right, guys. So today we're going to talk about the impeachment of President Johnson. Now, impeachment was in the news a lot. A couple of months ago. I know it seems like a million years ago because of this virus pandemic, but just 3 months ago, our country went through only its third impeachment of a president. President Trump was impeached about 3 months ago. He was accused of blocking funding for the Ukraine, which had been passed by Congress in order to get dirt on former Vice President Biden. And he held the money until he was accused of holding the money back until the Ukraine came up with the dirt. And then he refused to listen to any of the subpoenas that Congress had issued in this matter. So he was impeached on two articles. One, for abuse of power, for blocking the funding for the Ukraine in order to get dirt on Biden, and then for refusing to obey any of the subpoenas. And then President Trump had a trial. We're going to talk about the process in a little bit. And he was acquitted because the 2/3 vote. They didn't have the 2/3 vote to remove Trump from office. So that's why Donald Trump is still our president. All right, so let's go back to 1868 and talk about what happened there. Now, remember in our previous videos, we've been talking about this titanic struggle between the radical Republicans who are pushing their vision of Reconstruction, black rights, as well as punishment for the South, and President Johnson, who was opposed to black rights, almost all black rights, apart from emancipating the slaves, and was consistently trying to block Reconstruction. So the radical Republicans and President Johnson were constantly at each other's throats over the matter of Reconstruction. So the fight escalated in 1867 into early 1868. Now, relations just continued to deteriorate between the radical Republicans and Johnson. The radical Republicans were determined to advance their agenda, while Johnson was just as determined to sabotage that agenda. So the radicals were trying to limit Johnson's power as much as possible. Now, in March 1867, they passed a law called the Tenure of Office Act. Now, the Tenure of Office Act said that the president cannot fire a member of his cabinet unless he gets the permission of the United States Senate first. So, the president's cabinet, that's like Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of War, Attorney General, and so on, could not be fired by the president unless the Senate gave their permission. Now, you could make a solid case that the Tenure of Office Act is totally unconstitutional. The president does have the power to fire his own cabinet, and the Supreme Court ultimately ruled as much, but that was decades later. So the Tenure of Office Act was vetoed by Johnson, and of course the veto was overridden because remember the Republicans had 2/3 margin in both the House and the Senate. Now, the thing is that the Tenure of Office Act was passed for two reasons. One, it was passed to protect a man named Edwin Stanton. Edwin Stanton was the Secretary of War. He was a radical Republican. He had been a carryover from the Lincoln administration, and he did not agree with Johnson at all on Johnson's vision or lack of vision with regard to Reconstruction. So it was partly passed to protect Stanton, and it was also, in many ways, an impeachment trap, because the radical Republicans were hoping that Johnson would violate the Tenure of Office Act by firing a member of his cabinet, and then they would finally have grounds to impeach him. I know that sounds a little conspiratorial, but that was certainly something that was in the mind of the radical Republicans. Win-win. Protect Stanton, and if they can't protect Stanton, give them grounds to impeach President Johnson. Now, the smart approach for President Johnson would have been not to take the bait right? If somebody's trying to get you, you don't give them the ammunition, you don't give them the rope to hang you with. But Johnson was not the sort of person who was capable of that sort of thinking. So in August 1867, Johnson thought he was clever, and he suspended Stanton instead of firing him from office. Now, he replaced Stanton with General Grant. Now, General Grant is the most popular man in America. He was the Union general, the man who won the Civil War for the North. So Johnson was hoping that suspending Stanton and replacing him with Grant would have actually neutralized a lot of potential opposition, right? Because Grant was very popular. Now, the Senate refused to go along with this suspension, and President Grant was very angry about the fact that he was basically being used as a political pawn by Johnson. Remember, the same thing had happened back in 1866, the previous year, when Johnson brought Grant with him on that swing around the circle speech tour, hoping that some of Grant's popularity would rub off on him. So Grant was already angry at Johnson for that, but now he's being used as a pawn in Johnson's war with the radical Republicans. Grant stayed as acting Secretary of War for 4 months, but then he just left. And he literally left the door open to the War Department. Stanton walked back in, and he took his position as Secretary of War again. And he refused to leave the office, like literally, saying that, the president has no right to fire me. Now, Johnson was very, very angry, and this time fired Stanton. Period. Now, this gave the radical Republicans the rope to hang Andrew Johnson. Because the thing is, the Tenure of Office Act said you can't fire a member of your cabinet without Senate permission, and he fired a member of his cabinet, Edwin Stanton. So the radicals now had a case against Andrew Johnson. So the House of Representatives voted in early 1868 to impeach Andrew Johnson. So the House voted by a 126 to 47 vote margin to impeach Johnson. Now, I think this is the time to explain how the impeachment process works. Now, you guys might know a little bit more about it than some of my other classes in previous years because you guys have lived through an impeachment trial, an impeachment and then a trial with President Trump in the past few months. But just to recap, how does impeachment work? All right, so let's go over the process for impeaching the president. The first thing that's done is the House of Representatives votes to impeach. Now, people don't really understand what impeachment really means. People use the term impeachment to be interchangeable with kicking someone out of office, but that's not the case. Impeachment is just the first step in removing someone from office. So when you think of the word impeach, think of the word charge. So when you're impeaching someone, you're charging them with a crime. Well, you're charging them with an impeachable offense, which doesn't necessarily have to be a crime. That issue actually came up during Trump's impeachment situation. Now, in order to impeach the president or any federal official, the vote has to be 50+1. It has to be simple majority in order to impeach someone. So the House of Representatives voted 126 to 47, which is more than majority, to impeach Andrew Johnson or to charge him with violating the Tenure of Office Act. They impeached him on 11 counts, all related to violating the Tenure of Office Act, even though one of the counts was showing disrespect to Congress, which is, a little bit, kind of out there. But nine of the 11 charges were directly concerning Johnson firing Stanton. Okay, so this is the first part of the process, the impeachment process. They vote 50+1 to charge you, simple majority to charge you with an offense. The next part of the process is the case then goes to the United States Senate. Now, the United States Senate conducts a trial. So the House of Representatives makes their case about why they think you committed an impeachable offense, while the president, President Johnson or President Trump or whoever it would be, has the chance to make a defense about why he should not be convicted of those charges. So the Senate conducts a trial. Then, after the trial, the Senate has to vote by 2/3 to remove you from office. So half plus one, simple majority in order to impeach you, but in order to remove you from office, you need 2/3 of the vote. And then if you get 2/3 of the vote, if 2/3 of the senators vote guilty, then the president is removed from office, and then they're gone. Now, President Johnson was the first president to ever be impeached, ever. And one of only 3 presidents to ever be impeached. So Johnson now had to have his trial in the Senate. Now, Johnson had good reason to be very concerned about his prospects in the United States Senate. The Republicans had 2/3 of the seats in the United States Senate. They had more than that, in fact. So if every Republican voted guilty, Johnson would be removed from office. So 7 radical Republicans from the House of Representatives present the case against Johnson to the United States Senate. They're called the impeachment managers. In the Trump situation, that was Adam Schiff. It was the lead impeachment manager, Gerald Nadler, and some other congressmen. There were 7 House members who made the case against Andrew Johnson, including Thaddeus Stevens, the lead radical Republican who absolutely despised Andrew Johnson. Now, Johnson's lawyers actually had a pretty strong defense. One of the defenses, this one was a little less strong. They said, well, Johnson was just testing the law to see whether it was constitutional. He really wasn't violating it. But the biggest, strongest part of Johnson's defense was that the Tenure of Office Act said the president can't fire a member of his own cabinet. Stanton had been appointed by President Lincoln. So Johnson said, well, I didn't fire a member of my cabinet. Lincoln had appointed him. And probably the strongest thing that Johnson had in his favor was the fact that a lot of moderate Republicans just asked themselves, is this a little too extreme to actually impeach the president over this? For firing Stanton, not getting Senate permission. So a lot of Republicans were very worried that this would politicize the impeachment process to the extent that anytime Congress just doesn't like the president or doesn't agree with the president's policies, they could actually remove him from office. And a lot of moderates are very worried about the precedent that would set. That you can just remove a president just because you don't like him. That was an argument that Trump's lawyers made during his trial as well. Also, and this was another consideration the radical Republicans had to make, there was no vice president because Johnson, remember, was the vice president. He became president when Lincoln was assassinated. And back then, there was no apparatus to actually replace the vice president when the vice presidency became vacant. So there was no vice president. So the next person in the line of presidential succession was a man named Benjamin Wade. Remember, that was the guy who wrote the Wade-Davis Act back in 1864. And Benjamin Wade was an arch radical. He favored all sorts of out there things, like he wanted to give women the right to vote. So a lot of Republicans weren't thrilled about the idea of having Benjamin Wade as president because they just felt he was too radical. Plus, Johnson only had 11 months. About 11 months left in his term. So that was another consideration. Johnson probably had very little chance of getting reelected. So Johnson was going to be gone soon anyway. So is this really worth, going to this extreme of actually voting to remove him from office? So remember, you need 2/3 of the vote in the Senate to remove someone from office. In 1868, there were 54 senators. So that means you would need 36 to vote to remove him from office. That would be the 2/3 necessary. The final vote, when they held it on whether to remove Johnson from office, 35 senators voted guilty, 19 senators voted not guilty. So literally, Johnson is saved from removal from office by one vote. They just need 36. They need 36. They got 35 voted guilty. So Johnson was saved because 7 Republican senators voted not guilty because they felt that they didn't like Johnson, but they felt this did not justify removing Johnson from office. So you could argue each one of those 7 was the one vote to save Johnson from office. Now, one thing that probably saved Johnson, or the thing that saved Johnson probably, was that Johnson had on the low promised the Republicans that if they allowed him to stay in office, if they didn't remove him, then he wouldn't block Reconstruction anymore. So that probably saved Johnson more than anything else. So Johnson remained as president, but Johnson remained pretty much powerless for the rest of his administration. So let's jump ahead in history to the 20th century about subsequent instances of presidential impeachment. So Johnson was the first president to be impeached. The next president to almost be impeached was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was caught up in the Watergate scandal, where he was accused of covering up a break-in of Democratic headquarters by some of his people, by trying to use the CIA and the FBI to block the investigation. And the House Representatives the House Judiciary Committee voted to 3 charges of impeachment, 3 articles they're called of impeachment. The House Representatives was going to vote on whether to impeach President Nixon, but Nixon resigned from office before he could be impeached. So Nixon never was impeached, even though the impeachment process had already started. In 1998, President Clinton was accused of lying under oath about whether he had ever had sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky. They asked him if he had. He said he didn't, because he didn't consider what he and Monica Lewinsky had done to be sex. The Republicans said, well, yes, it was, and they impeached him for perjury, for lying under oath about whether he had sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky. So he was impeached by the House. The Senate, he had a trial. This was in 1998. He had a trial in the Senate. Again, remember, they need 67 senators in order to remove him from office. Only 50 voted guilty. Even some Republicans voted not guilty, because they said, is this reason really to remove the president from office for lying about sex? That was the second presidential impeachment, and the third attempt. Remember, Nixon resigned before he could be impeached. And then the third presidential impeachment was the one that we lived through a few months ago. President Trump, as we said in the beginning of the video, was accused of blocking aid to the Ukraine unless they gave him dirt on Joe Biden and Joe Biden's son, and regarding business relationship that Joe Biden's son had with the Ukrainian company. And then refusing to obey any congressional subpoenas, blocking the congressional investigation into this matter. The House Representatives voted to impeach President Trump. Then the trial went to the Senate. And in the Senate vote, remember, you need 67 senators. You need 2/3 in order to remove the president from office. So you need 67. 48 senators voted guilty. Every Democrat voted to remove Trump from office, and one Republican, Mitt Romney, who would run for president, who was the Republican nominee for president back in 2012, but is now a senator from Utah, also voted guilty. But that's only 48. You need 67. So Trump didn't come anywhere near the number of votes to remove him from office. That trial that we lived through a few months ago is very controversial, because the Republicans who were conducting the trial refused to call any witnesses, which, certainly have strengthened the case against Trump. But, in light of what's going on now, that seems like ancient history, even though it was only a few months ago. All right, guys. So check the website. Check the website tonight for your reading assignment. That you'll have to do over the next few days. And then again, for in a couple of days, check YouTube again for our next video. All right, guys. Until then.